The last few cutters raced back down to us, veering about as the storm's frontier arrived. I sounded the alert across the city. The tether on the beacon was wound in, the storehouses were sealed and guards posted. The world was gone now. But if everyone followed my plan, we'd be alive to see it again. Just perhaps not much longer after that. We had one major weapon against the storm, our crater. The gales on the edge of the maelstrom didn't collapse down upon us, but merely glanced above our heads. This sucked air upwards to join the fray, and led to these bursts, these squalls of dead wind dropping down to equalize the pressure. So Six said. To the ordinary man, it merely felt chilly. Chilly was the word indeed. It was -90, but felt warmer if you stood over the steam pipes that lined the streets. Those things could and did fry eggs, but such laxity was no longer permitted. Everyone had their rations, they had their homes reinforced, their fuel stowed, and their fears in check. No one really knew what would happen as the storm intensified, but there was nothing we could do now, so best settle in. All we needed to do was avoid being stupid. Best way to survive was to be calm and stick to the plan. The mates were good at that. They were still digging pits for our spare coal on that first day of the storm, and a few people braved the chills to help them out. It wasn't so different to the day before. In fact, the city was far more alive than usual, on account of our hunters and scouts, numbering some 200 by that point, being freed of the constant cycle of expedition and sleep. Everyone was milling about the streets, was warmer beside the heat tower than in the pub. That night's fights took place in the city centre, then. Two bloody fools took to the iron rods when things got ugly. Someone reported it to me. I had outlawed duels during the emergency period. Got there to find a Dummer and a Yank on the ground, both missing teeth. Dummer died in the infirmary, and people told me locking the kids up in a box was unnecessary. Cleared the streets. It was time to grab a few hours rest while our newest thermometers bottomed out at -100, a wonderful milestone. In the morning there was a rumbling feeling, followed shortly by the news that the tunnels our mates had dug down into the coal veins were collapsing. Timbers had been made brittle as the cold crept down into the earth, and the water pumps on the rock faces had jammed up. Groundwater turned to ice, expanded, and shattered the tunnel walls. In other words, to get to the coal, we'd have to constantly replace the timbers and pump the water by hand, human hand. I had volunteers for it. I locked them up in their houses. Told them already, nothing stupid, didn't I? From then on, only people allowed out were the workers, with a guard shadowing each. I was done protecting them from God, now had to save them from themselves. Save New London. The only problem was the voice of New London was silenced. The hall couldn't take -100. Hot broth was brown ice in minutes. The streets were quiet then. No more work orders and no more information. The most dangerous possible arrangement. Concern about the fuel had everyone on the edge of panic already, and without a voice telling them the numbers again and again, hour after hour, they began to invent their own. I moved back in with Six. He'd got his lab still pretty balmy on account of a solid foot of books, papers, and old hardened wood mulch lining the walls. Clever chap, but it's hard to explain, but as I lay there on that second night, surrounded by bits of my own speeches sticking out of the walls at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth of New London, my custom pristine truth, was twisting, corrupting, and now coming to envelop me. A strange thought, but as I've said, that is what the dark and noise of the storm does to your mind. It was hard to sleep. Six didn't sleep. He was up all night trying to modify a thermometer's lower boundary down. He succeeded, as he always has done, and happily informed me the next morning that it was now averaging -110 around the city. Could see my breath now. For those out in the houses, things were getting bad. Days of cold had sucked the use out of the walls. The wood was going the way of the mine timbers, with crystals gradually sprouting out through splinters on the interior side. A few of them had dragged their radiators together and strung up sheets to trap the air around them. They were back in tents again, but it worked, and the guards spread the idea as they did their inspection. Inspection reached the coal stores and found a broken lock and missing stock. The fools weren't done testing me. House-to-house search found nothing but a bunch of shivering New Londoners. Who knows, it was probably the guards who stole the stuff in the first place. Not all of them were especially bright. In fact, the search itself proved it, since half the time they opened the front door to get into the houses, and the burst of freezing air that let in would take hours of misery to rectify. Told Six to close the heat tower vents for a few hours to help out, but no longer. We had to save our emergency measures for the real trouble, which was yet to come. I should explain that our analysis of Nansen's research informed us that it really was going to be darkest before the dawn. The movement of the storm, its size, density, and internal dynamics had all created a strange effect where the winds that trailed it were trapped there in the rear. They had been the longest without seeing sunlight, and so while not the fastest, they were the coldest. Had that to look forward to. At least that bloody search revealed that a good portion of the population had hypothermia already. I present that as a positive, for they'd have died if we didn't drag them out, kicking and screaming, to the infirmary. No one wanted to be away from their safe place, even if they were dying there, huddled in their mass like those I left on the Atrabates. Not this time. In New London, anyone was mine to command, and I commanded that they live. They were determined to work against me, though. With people from all the different houses clustered in the infirmaries for a while, they started sharing stories, and stories is all they were. Talk of how the storm would get worse, of how the generator was running dry, of how I was tearing the dying away from their families in their final moments. Doesn't matter how true it was, their stories were poison. The people, ready for anything just days ago, had been pressed, squeezed down to their knees by the storm. The endless rattling, where every snap could be the last thing you hear, where every second away from the radiator was agony. Nobody was sane. Nobody was safe. And they knew it was getting worse. And they knew that the tower vents could be closed. Things were starting to fall into place. Another Kamasi. The people had become desperate and forgot who they were, who I was. They knew there was relief to the pain. They knew it would make the plan fail. They knew both truths, and focused only on the best one, as I had taught them. In Africa, it had been the banditry of the nationalists and the allure of weapons to take revenge. Here it was the injustice of being one who died to keep the city alive, and the allure of killing everyone so that you might die in comfort. And this time, no Connaught to come along and shoot the guilty and innocent alike into oblivion. I had to do that for myself. If only 3 people survived this time, it would be very nearly my fault. Would have been my fault entirely, if the rebels hadn't struck first. It was the morning of the 42nd day, the centre of the storm, but not yet the worst of it. Our guards braved minus 120 degrees to walk the streets and ask after people's health at each door. And how did they repay them? With lies. They said they were fine. Damned fools didn't care if it was too cold for the ill to stay. They wanted them to stay for the bloody company. This wasn't Kamasi. It was the people who were the killers, not the troops. I told the guards to enact martial law. We had to survive 2 more days at least. Too cold to eat, too cold to drink half the time. But it wasn't too cold to listen to bloody orders and keep New London alive. I would force them to survive. And they would force me to kill them, one way or another. Guards were attacked as they broke open doors. Inside, the houses were already battlegrounds between true New Londoners and the rebels. The action stirred up a push for the heat tower. Rebels burst from houses and the infirmaries and rushed to gather beneath it, at least 100 of them. They locked the vents closed and faced off against the gathering ring of guards encircling them. I was above, looking out of a gap in the lab window that I carved through the plaster of wood mulch. In the houses exposed to the outside air, there wasn't much point sitting around the radiator until everyone was back in and the door closed for good, So the more peaceful residents piled out into the streets, mostly joining with our guards. The rebels called for me to come answer to them. Told Chalk to maintain the perimeter, pulled on a second coat and traipsed out. The siege parted and I stood before the crowd. Everyone was shouting, but you couldn't hear it over the wind. I had a megaphone brought up and a wire ran back to the lab to power it. Then I explained that the heat tower was liable to explode if the rebels didn't stand down at once. I handed it off to Six to explain it too. The Hero of New London medal amplified his words. Our side of the crowd was alive with support. They were as scared, sad, and hopeless as anyone else, but they knew I was right. They were calling out for the rebels to see reason, and sometimes trying to drag them away, but they were battered back. They were begging me to do something. What? You know what. New London gave us no choice. Ollie and Chalk closed in on the tower. They had a squad of guards each, with rifles, some with bayonets. This was the Saber's Edge. This was the final chance for sanity. As if it had a chance, with the hollow moan of Earth itself being destroyed echoing from the heavens. I sound pessimistic, and in truth, plenty of rebels broke ranks and fled. Ordered they be let through, but some of the crowd started chasing them. A dedicated group remained glued to the heat tower's scaffold though, screaming obscenities, traitorous things not worth repeating, and clearly caring for nothing but the lives I had let them keep. Die with dignity was their principal demand. But this was martial law, and to accept death was long since outlawed. Tried to take them to the prison, but when the guards got close, the rebels lost their composure and attacked with everything they had, which was not very much at all. They threw themselves at us, at the bayonets. Blades could barely get through all the layers of coats and furs, but they did. In their final acts, they broke another law. They failed to die when I said they could die. The drawn blood was like spices in the pot. The crowd was enraged at the depth of the rebels' treachery. The energy possessed my guards and they stopped listening to me. I think, in retrospect, they might have tuned in to the voice of God instead, for now they declared their unerring righteousness and promised to save the city by cleansing it of doubters, plotters, and liars. It was a mob unrivaled since the age of witches. Or, I'll say nothing else of it. The doors that had remained closed were opened, and everybody was uprooted. As crowds dashed about, I sent as many as I could to the labs to hide. One by one I grabbed the guardsmen out of the houses and ended the rifle point interrogations. Most of them listened to me right away, and the rest acquiesced after seeing the pistol snugly fit in my glove. I planned to round them all up for a roll call of the militia, but long before I found them all I was called to the main infirmary. 3 guards ran past me in the other direction as I approached. Inside, Painsworth was lain up on a hospital bed with a doctor on either side of her. Their boots slipped about in the blood dripping down from the bed frame. Witnesses told me Painsworth had been accused of complicity with the conspirators, given that they had planned these things under her nose. Only evidence I had against it was that Painsworth had more than half a brain. The finest asset a human can possess, yet a moron can take it away from you without thought. With the troops in my entourage, I returned to the search. People were starting to seal their doors again and settle down, but at the other end of the city there was a crowd around the grounded beacon. Found out what they were doing before I got there. The beacon began to rise, beneath it hanging a dull brown wreath, a wreath of rebels. I ordered everyone with a rifle to open fire. Precious seconds passed while they puzzled over this order, then upon repetition they obeyed. A continuous thunder of shots poured in the general direction of the beacon. The balloon was 3 inches of rubbery membrane. Bullets probably bounced off it, since it kept rising up without so much as a tremor. But we kept firing, with my orders being to lower our sights. I took a rifle myself, centered the iron dimples on the hanging wreath, and emptied the magazine. Maybe at least one rebel got their wish, and left this world before the storm snatched them all away, snapped the beacon tether and whisked them off to die in terror. They were gone by the time I had reloaded. I think many people in the crowd had supposed the beacon could be returned, their captives suitably punished by a stint in the maelstrom. They were quiet when I rushed up, although perhaps they had heard the vast amount of gunfire and supposed I was more villain than they. The guns were levelled and everyone was ordered home. No questions were asked. A few had already gotten frostbite from being outside all morning. What could they say? Painsworth had it worse. After all that, the heat tower safety vents were opened to let off some steam. Problem was that the reduction in steam temperature this caused allowed the last small digits of heat to trickle away in the houses. The water pipe started freezing, so after a few hours I was forced to turn the safety off again. We had to make it 2 more days, but the heat tower would crack before then, 6 was insisting. What were we to do? Easy. Listen to the voice of New London when it came to your door, and otherwise do absolutely nothing. Radiators get hot, then sit by them. Radiators get cold, then there's a reason, so just wait like everyone else. It was extremely simple, and after the sobering 40-second day, people finally got it. A few boys dragged the bodies near the heat tower into the snow, then hurried back inside. 21 confirmed dead, 6 more missing, plenty more injured. At least ice for the bruises was easy to come by. Ran the generator without the safety for most of the night, and so we survived, with only 100 or so new cases of hypothermia and the occasional beginnings of frostbite. Infirmaries and even the emergency medical tents were full, 1 in every bed, 1 on the floor beside every bed, and it was only going to get worse. The maelstrom was thinning, and the daylight was more noticeable than the days prior, but the heat tower was groaning, shuddering, and even deforming under the pressure. I had to open the valves, and when I did, the chimneys at the top almost exploded. 6 begged me to leave them open until tomorrow, when the worst of the worst was due. For New London then, the radiators went cold. This is a figure of speech, for they were still far too hot to touch, but when the air is -120 and the wind is racing, it has to be on the verge of melting to reach you just a foot away. With the medics overloaded and Painsworth the colour of the sky, it seemed like death finally had us in its grasp. I was shivering there, alone in the lab. 6 and the rest of the engineers had retreated to their homes. Lab was warmer, but the darkness had taken them all. They had people they wished to die with. It was against the law, but as I've said, I allowed weakness to be earned. They'd got us this far, but it wasn't enough, they despaired. Fools. They had forgotten that New London cannot die. I went around and told them as much again and again. When I ordered them back out into the street, they did as I said. What other proof do you need? I needed those fellows to play the city's trump card. Just as we escaped death in the city by draining the Frostlands of life, now we could escape death in our dark huddles by sacrificing the life the city had borne, the mates. More precisely, we could use their steam core drives to heat water and illuminate spaces for new infirmaries. Crammed people from various houses together so we could demolish a few, then built new wards in their place. Well, the mates did all this. In essence, we just watched them deconstruct each other on command, then the survivors used the body parts to give us sanctuary. They were the finest New Londoners of them all, and deserved every salute they got as they knelt down, let out a blast on their horns, and awaited their end. Ran the generator hot to try and get the new places usable. As we did, there was a sound from the crater's edge. It sounded like an explosion. Guards reported that when they arrived to investigate, a lockbox had bashed its way down the glacier and clanked onto the lift. Inside was a barely legible message asking for the lift to be raised. It was an out-of-the-question impossibility that someone could be there, but I ordered the lift up. Took almost an hour, its gears stuffed with ash and its steam core being robbed of heat, but it got up there. Waited a few minutes, then brought it back down. Couldn't actually see it when it was at the very top, and we only knew it hadn't been blown away by virtue of the rapidly oscillating chains that ran down below it. We had to go inside to wait out the thing's descent. When it reached us, There was a man with a heavily laden sled standing on it. He wasn't standing for long. We rushed out and dragged him and the sled into a medical tent. It was the man I had sent out to look for his daughter. The daughter was stowed deep in the cargo on the sled. Had mining charges in there too, from Winterhome. Assessment was that they would live, albeit without a few of those blackened limbs. A bloody miracle. We'd need another Hero of New London medal. Evening was coming, and the temperature was dropping. The merciless rearguard of the storm was at our gates. The generator was still complaining loudly, but we had no choice but to close all the vents to have any hope of keeping the infirmaries mild enough for life. The houses, where most people were huddled, were a lost cause. There was a sense of doom, an order of magnitude more compelling than that of the previous month, or even the previous week. New London was now each house, each huddle. We wished each other good luck on a final round of inspections that evening. The crowds in the infirmaries were quiet, their soldier stares masked by anything and everything they could wrap around themselves. The walls around them rattled and cracked, the pipes rang and clanked, the lamps swung and flickered. The ice crawled along beams and up the bedposts before their eyes. I have no idea how cold it was, but it was a damn sight colder than 120 that night. We had to lock off most of the steam pipes so that what little could reach the infirmaries wasn't already just cold water. Didn't make much difference for most houses anyway. Plumbing had all burst as ice grew inside the pipes. The last moments of the Atrabates crew were playing out in every home across New London. I was on the scaffold of the heat tower with Six and a few of his protégés. You know what? It was pretty damn hot. The generator had all moderating factors slashed away and was burning hotter than ever before. Flakes of snow turned to steam as they hit the sides, then immediately back to snow just a few feet away. The whole thing was swaying more and more, to the point where we all felt compelled to hang on to the railings. Six was screaming at me again and again that it was liable to explode at any minute. The inner workings of the tower were visibly glowing red hot. If anything melted, it was over. I finally gave in when the whole thing whined like a dying horse. The valve levers snapped open by themselves as soon as the locks on them were released, and the entire tower was dug an inch deeper into the ground by the rocket of yellowish steam that pierced the sky, with us foolish humans clasping onto the railings with no justification for being alive so close to that power. It died down, and we could open our eyes. The lights on the outside of the infirmaries fizzled out as their steam cores were parched, then flooded. Those inside heard the screams of the heat tower and knew at once why New London had done this to them. I scaled down a ladder to the ground and picked up the brittle megaphone. This was it, I supposed. I cried out, with my breath turning to ice and scattering like dust in front of me, for everyone to gather at the heat tower. It was coming up to 6 o'clock after all, morning briefing time. New London obeyed. Wretched things emerged from the houses and hospitals. People dragged themselves and others over to lie in the broken earth around the tower. It was so cold that 2 minutes in the street was enough to claim a hand or foot. When the able went to help the slow frostbitten, they were bitten themselves. After 10 minutes, we had the whole city piled in a heap before me, everyone shaking uncontrollably, so much that they couldn't even moan at the pain as their flesh died, cell by cell. Flecks of molten metal fell from the heat tower, but cooled before they landed on the dying below. We made some effort to get people up onto the scaffold where it was warmer, but only a score were fit enough for the ascent. That was it then. The mates had been immobilized and just swayed back and forth here and there around the city. Had enough coal loaded in the tower for another hour of heat. Just had to stand there, look down to see if any wisps of breath were still coursing around down in the pile of humanity, and look up at the relentless sky. I had 8 bullets in my pistol, but not the dexterity to fire it. The will, though, I had that. I was willing to let God win. He was right. We were over. and misery was all that remained if we disobeyed him. I couldn't give New London an easy death. I was forcing them down the worst road to the end I could find. Half dead, half alive, and getting the worst of both. I was constantly awoken from my stupor of despair by the knowledge that everyone else was in a worse state and was still following my order, still staying alive. I was probably the only one who really saw all the details of what happened in the sky around 7:30 on the morning of the 44th day. The Maelstrom's rear edge approached quite suddenly, at a sprinting pace, faster than the rest of the storm. The wind died away over perhaps 10 minutes. It is better to say it was pushed away. The high-pressure air, prophesied to be trailing the storm, had arrived. It was attacking the storm, shrinking it faster than it could escape. The air cleared. The sun was already above the crater lip in the east, blinding us with light that was once called faint. The warm air from above came down on us like the merciful breath of Satan. It fell fast, and it almost burned us. We didn't know then, but later we figured we'd had 100-degree improvement or more in just a few minutes, which was a change so rapid that it stung like acid on your skin and drove people to crawl out into the frozen ash beside the street. Some of them jumped away as the steam pipes hidden underneath fizzled back to life. The glow of the heat tower was fading, and the pumps were still operational. Lights snapped back on around the city as the steam cores were refilled. The mates let their horns sound, and those with any life left in them stumbled onto the compressors to drink. I was standing absolutely still, clinging onto the railing, looking around as moaning turned to a kind of laughter, and weak limbs gestured at the sky. I kept looking up and down, up and down. I was right. I was right then, I had been right before. I was right all along. Someone got their hands on my megaphone down there and screamed it. We are alive. It was barely true, but it was no story either. I hurriedly got everyone down from the tower scaffold. We turned the pressure down to ease it back into normal operation, and I had Hodge, who was one of the dozen or so people without injury, go out and get the mate to bring us more coal. It was all happening too fast. I pulled down the rags across my face. The air was still well below zero, didn't need a thermometer to tell that, but it was back in the realm of earthly temperatures, like how it had been while we were walking to New London in the first place. It got warmer as the sunshine went on and midday approached. By then, we had completed the very slow process of getting the immobile to the infirmaries and everyone else to the makeshift hospitals in the mess hall and the houses closest to the tower. Had about 600 cases of frostbite to deal with, and no doctors. Almost the whole city needed a heat bath and constant regulation of the temperature to avoid making it worse. Luckily enough, those sacrifices we made earlier allowed the mates to handle it for everyone en masse. Making amputations, that was another matter entirely, eventually worked through by taking an approach of triage so that the doctors were on their feet first. They told me I was suffering from hypothermia while I was helping out. So what? I was alive. The city was alive. The god-forsaken remnants of civilization, of a species that we were, was alive. The storm made its merry way off, and the desert air moved on in. Proof that belief in my prophecies was worth much more than belief in the perpetrator of all this. That night, we slept in 20 degrees. Heaven on earth. Or merely New London. Not everyone made it through the next couple of days. They were released from New London's service. They were happy to have seen the city return to life. Chalk finally lived up to his name, the bugger. Most people were back on their feet by then, though. The frost had not set in for long enough to be beyond removal, and we had people out walking the Frostlands after the lift was repaired. There wasn't much out there. Winterhome remained a mark on the landscape, with all remaining buildings collapsed and covered in snowdrifts. Found some dead animals to bring back for our cooks. Tesla City's walls were mostly still standing, but the force field tower was lying on its side, the buildings it crushed as it fell having been cleaned away by the wind. The nearby hot springs had nearly thawed the ice that covered them by the time we got there, and there was still movement in the water below. By rationing our stored supplies and doing what we could to find more out there, we had a few weeks of breathing room. We continued to live, and but for the murderers who needed to return to London, we were all fine. New London got its voice back, and everyone listened. Those old doubts about whether we deserved to live were gone. Life was the gift I had given them here, and I gave it to none who did not deserve it. It was around then that our boffins schemed up the creation of the glasshouses. We used the space cleared from empty houses and storage pits to create these boiling hot enclosures heated by steam and the magnification of the summer sun. As you must have seen, we could use them to finally grow potato plants with fertilizer from Winterhome. Mates took great care looking after them. Had to hang on until the onset of winter before they were ready, but our hunters found what we needed, and our growing outpost at the hot springs kept us off the New London special. We saw -40, -50 that winter, but what was that to us? We drove on through in good order, no incidents of theft, no panic, just carrying on for New London. Then, that spring came, that real spring, courtesy of the storm. Broke zero. Had to enjoy that, since it's only going to get colder as the years go by. Well, now you probably want to know where we went if you're reading this. If you ever walked the west coast and puzzled about this Hephaestus I mentioned, then here's your answer. We took it south. New London is capable of withstanding many more winters, but you must admit, it is a little on the chilly side. We spent the summer of '87 getting the old American dreadnought back in order. Only part of the hull was of any use really, so it was a hell of a lot of work, but digging out Tesla City let us make a dozen more mates to sort it out. It's September 2nd as I write this, just over a year since the storm. Sea will ice up again soon, so we're going to take our leave of this latitude and see what spring is like in Bordeaux these days. With any luck, the mates will go back to London after they push us out. They'll have strict orders to go home, just as we do. That's right, Lord Gloucester had given me orders to return to England as soon as possible, back in the airship over Edgware. We'll get close. Was enough of a bugger to grow crops outside in Blighty even before the Great Frost. I don't know what to expect down there, to be frank. We've all speculated on whether other groups survived. It seems impossible that no one else is out there. But if you take the discussion further than the pub, you can suppose that while there's a scant chance people survive the cold and the storm, you have to factor in the chance that they didn't go the way of Winterhome, or Tesla City, or bloody London. What's the chance of a group surviving all those tests? I bothered to write this, so clearly there's a wide-eyed child in me yet. There's something else in there too. Some hope I don't dare embrace. We won't know until we get to Rem. Six says the stuff we need is there, but there's a chance we aren't all going to die, regardless of what happens. And if there's a chance, well, we're alive, and there was only the slimmest chance of that. If you've read through the notes from the Royal Society on the sun dimming, you might be interested in a new theory. A couple of the nannies had these calculations to show that the Yellowstone blast might have thrown pieces of the Earth away into the cosmos. Very small pieces, but lots of them. A form of big mega dust. This created a wave, a screen of the stuff that is slowly but surely making its way out into the unknown. What we've come to believe is that this dust is the true cause of the observation of solar dimming. By virtue of its position relative to our orbit, it makes spring and summer cold but doesn't do much to winter, which fits with what we've experienced, wouldn't you agree? The dust should, they say, disperse gradually as it travels. In other words, the dimming will reverse, although we can't say when without finding intact instruments, and without this theory holding any water whatsoever, of course. but you must have learned the value of a scant thread of truth in a tapestry of happy illusions, so I'm sure you'll forgive me wasting your time with this. New London is yours now then, whoever you are. You're the new captain. I wouldn't recommend the job, but it must be done. We'll be in the Riviera by the time anyone finds this, most likely. Or I suppose it could even be a great many years. There is every chance that we all died unceremoniously. Perhaps you already know. But you also know, I hope, that if I failed doing everything I needed to do. And I hope also that you see, in retrospect, all I've ever done in New London is to keep us on the one narrow path that brought us to this victorious voyage home. You'll think whatever you like, no doubt. Just giving you the truth, if you want it. If you're going to be spending time in New London, you'd best listen to its words. Whoever you are, I have 2 pieces of advice for you. First, don't go digging too deep in the lot across the way from the beacon. Second, if you ever have the interest, why don't you find an old map and look up where London used to be? With any luck, there'll be something new there waiting for you, weather permitting. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of The Last of the Lamplight. It was good fun to write, despite being quite a sad tale. Decided to give it something of a happy ending, but then again this is a story with a dishonest narrator, you could say, so it's hard to say how things really went down in the pure canon anyway. That said, that's the end of this narrative. The next one coming along, if you're watching this as it comes out, will be in the new Three Kingdoms Total War. What precisely that's going to be and what it's going to be like is what I need to decide next, so I guess I best go get on with that. Special thanks to everyone who donates on Patreon to make projects like this one possible. You can join their illustrious ranks via the link in the description, etc. You know the drill. So that's all from me. I'll see you in another video, and in the meantime, stay warm out there, folks.